When it comes to animated studios, we take a look back on the iconic ones and impactful ones like Disney, Pixar, and the breakouts like DreamWorks and Sony, all very unique that are able to tell a wide variety of interesting stories. But when it comes to looking at the worst of all of them, comes up with the one and only Illumination, one that I've really grown to hate over the years. And this is not to say they are completely awful, I mean they are for the most part bad films, but it's just more of what they're geared for doing, being kids films and only kids films, and that is the stigma that we've said for years. I mean, that's not to say kid films are bad, considering I've grown up with Disney and the other ones I mentioned earlier, but these movies also have an element that you come to appreciate story-wise when you grow up, becoming more impactful in your life and the world that animation has to offer. And another major problem to why I hate Illumination comes from the fact of how most of their movies feel exactly the same in style. Like literally looking at the basic details of all of them, including Mario in that form, it just really doesn't feel innovative at all designed to make the most money and profit, which is the only real thing that they're good at. Because despite being bad story-wise, Illumination at the very least knows how to make a box office success, looking at Mario for obvious reasons, but also the Minions movies, where in fact 8 of their films are among the top 50 highest grossing animated films of all time, and they have only made 13 films at this point in time, proving how successful they are in that way. But that, of course, is also a problem to be discussed, because in this video I wanted to explain my hatred of Illumination and why I don't like them as an animated studio, something that many have expressed over the years here on YouTube, but just wanted to add an extra take for someone like me who has talked positively about their movies like Mario in some aspects, but definitely not as a regular movie-going experience like most of Illumination has produced. Because once again, we have to reiterate the fact that I find the most frustrating is the fact that Universal owns them, considering they also own DreamWorks. Illumination was originally formed as their own animation arm of that company until they bought DreamWorks to become the Pixar to their Disney, which of course, in my opinion, dilutes their ability to create great quality films for the studio when they have DreamWorks to justify that now. Because if I'm going to be honest with you, Despicable Me was actually a great film to start with them as a new studio to try and do something creative. Although it was similar to Megabyne in aspects of making the villain become the hero, it still carried something great emotionally with Gru and 3 orphan little girls, figuring out where he wants to commit to his life into doing. It was truly a great basis that launched the studio and its multiple franchises, showing some sort of promise of where it wanted to go. But unfortunately, that all fell flat and went nowhere as time went on, because in fact the very next film they would make would be a live-action computer animated film, which is clearly different and their only live-action film to date because of how fucking awful it was. And to this day, I refuse to remember anything about this film because of how stupid it was, something I've held and thought when it was released and still hold to this day, where I rather watch Paint Dry or Sonic. I'm not saying Sonic was boring or bad, but I'm saying it's a better concept and story to what Hop did and has James Marsden in it also. I mean, I just don't understand what exactly they were thinking by making this movie after Despicable Me. I mean, at the very least with this film, it has live action and warranted different animations, something they wouldn't do later on, but that was only to be real, where it just seemed better for them to stick to straight up animated movies as we see when time goes on, instead of this, because this is the most shallow film they've ever produced with nothing to offer. The main villain of this film is more of a hero than the main hero himself, and other characters that are just completely stupid, and I just don't want to talk about it. I mean, at the very least for Illumination, it was a learning experience, one that stated never do hybrid movies ever again because we are not the studio that is capable of making stories in the slightest, where to their credit, they actually tried improving upon in those capabilities because the main protagonist of this film is very fucking awful. But their improvement wasn't a lot because the next film was to dive into Dr. Seuss with the Lorax, where sadly, it wasn't their last one either. This one returned us to the style similar to Despicable Me and the one they would stick throughout, continuing on with Despicable Me 2 after this film. And the problem with films like this, and something that we would see later on with the Grinch, is how Illumination doesn't quite get how to adapt Dr. Seuss stories, completely missing the point of characters and its messages, like the hypocritical marketing that this movie had and the promotion that went against the message of the Lorax itself, and removing the ambiguity of the one-slur and just being the most frustrating experience focusing on this Ted dude who wants to impress a girl and can only do that by getting a tree. I mean, that's got to be the least effective way of storytelling to spread an important message that the original story was trying to present, especially when the entire town sings how great their corporatized life is at the beginning, only to suddenly change their minds at the end because of this damn tree, and only now realizing that things like your son Wesley glowing green is a bad thing, even though that should have never happened at the beginning to be actually shocked at. But they were gladly accepting that at the beginning, and now, only now, are they actually saying it's bad. But this movie never really wanted to develop its characters other than the main one, and the villain has nothing to say either. It's just a fucking nerd who gets to sell air, and that's why he's bad. He just sells air for profit, and that's the only development development we need for him and not actually saying anything special or background of him as a compelling villain. It's just nothing but disrespectful to the real goals of the original story for many in the public eye, including myself. And after this is where they would go back to Despicable Me 2, and that's where they really kickstarted Illuminations Success as an animation studio and financially almost making $1 billion for the first time in their history. And I will give it credit for still trying to have something to say, but like the rest of the style, it really doesn't develop anything properly. This film just has a lot more fluff and elements that really hamper it from being a good story, and of course putting in more bigger emphasis on the minions that would kickstart their entire franchise for some reason because of how successful this shallow sequel was. And rather than talking about this film's problems is where I would like to talk about the stagnant animation style once again that this film continued from the first film and the Lorax, because unlike Disney or Pixar and like Sony and Warner Brothers, they outsource their animation rather than produce it themselves in-house. This is where they leave it to Illumination Studios Paris to make their films that they have just done since the Lorax. I'm not saying it's a completely bad or awful thing for them to do considering it's still under their arm, but it does cheapen the overall experience like the movies themselves. They hardly innovate or have something to say, which I guess is fine being the way that they are, but combining that with the overall story of each film, there's just basically nothing to say, and I really hate those details. They aren't really a good animation studio on that behalf, knowing they primarily make kids films and outsource it to that. That's not good at all. I mean, credit to them for reducing costs in the budget of these films, but beyond that, with the bland and shallow storytelling, it really doesn't add anything different despite it being financially successful. And of course, because of the success of Despicable Me 2, they just had to make a movie focusing on the background of the minions for some reason, where I think it's safe to say I do not like it. There is nothing that warranted them having a story at all other than being the textbook definition of a kids movie and nothing more than a kids movie, because minions have nothing to say as characters at all rather than being the background to Gru's character. The only scene that works in this movie is the opening where they accidentally killed off all the other evil masters in history, which is the only extent you need so far as exploring their background as characters. Everything else is utterly useless, and it shows with this bare bones plot. You cannot create anything compelling with minions except merchandise, which is exactly what this movie is designed to be at its core, being the kids movie it was, because somehow this movie made over $1 billion and solidified the other Despicable Me movies as billion-dollar successes as well, which is baffling to me, except the fact that these characters have become extremely marketable in the process, and so throughout the many other products that Universal has. But at the very least, after releasing this film, they would try to create 2 original stories once again in Sing and the Secret Life of Pets. But like everything else, these films are not compelling or great in any way. The concept of these films are flawed with the kind of direction trying to introduce us to a hidden world with no real great effort and lackluster to what Pixar did as well. Because clearly, this is a film that is trying to be Toy Story of the dog world, which Illumination cannot do. The studio isn't even half of what Pixar is at its lowest, and I don't feel invested in the story where their emotional moments are too far and too few between to even matter, going into a pointless buddy adventure that's too fast to even care about. And the sequel makes things 10 times worth going off onto different tangents than what it wants to focus on. I mean, at its core, it still does what the first one did well, which to be fair isn't saying much, but I will give it credit for continuing what they wanted out of this film, which still makes it worse than the original because it focuses on these stupid subplots alongside its main. Just nothing about The Secret Life of Pets is really a compelling movie project, and it shows by what they did in these films. But at the very least, other than that, Sing actually provided a much better experience overall and something more compelling than what Pets provided. There are a lot of elements to be enjoyed in these films and what it tries, but what it tries is not what I like, sadly. The pop songs they sing just feel annoying. I mean, not all of them, but I just never gravitate towards it in either of these films, and it just feels like doing the bare minimum for a story focusing on the singing aspect at heart. Not exactly what I look for in a story, even though I've enjoyed many musicals in the past. It's just that, for me personally, I do not find this particularly interesting, but can see its merits for attempting something unique with a story that Illumination can succeed with beyond their bare bones kid fluff. I mean, it is still bare bones for presenting anthropomorphic animals that look meh in my opinion, singing pop songs you would hear on the radio, and that's something kids would want to see, I guess. But beyond that, the world itself is boring, and everything surrounding the circumstances of the characters are not very interesting. It's not very developed well, and it's bland, where films like Zootopia are a far better, superior storytelling experience than what Sing could ever do. Like, goodness, these films are actually annoying in my opinion. And like I said, including the sequels of these films, Sing would actually be the last original film they would have for a while when they realized, due to the fact that at the same time, Pixar was actually releasing more sequels to great financial success like Finding Dory and The Incredibles 2, bringing us back once again to Despicable Me 3 to somehow continue the story that really has nowhere to go virtually, and bringing us back to the minions like they did with the Rise of Gru in 2022. And I really just have nothing to say about Despicable Me 3. There's just nothing they actually tried to develop with Gru, and of course its main villain, which has nothing to say at all. I mean, at the very least, I will give Rise of Gru credit for actually focusing on something that the Minions movie should have had with Gru himself, because that's a far more interesting idea for them story-wise. But beyond that, it's just a fairly standard, simple, same kids film that they have produced all along. But then of course they have to drag themselves down adapting another Dr. Seuss story with the Grinch, where at this point you should never allow them to adapt any of his stories anymore because they are fucking incapable of doing so. Once again, only the young kids could actually enjoy this story that doesn't really add anything remotely interesting beyond that generic slop that misses what is important to the actual story of the Grinch that was actually being told. The character of the Grinch himself in this film is basically ruined by adding a sympathetic story and making him do things before he's supposed to do it in the original story, where his design is just a fluffy green boy and not a threatening menace like the original films and story tried to portray him as. You don't feel this at all because it really wants to be the uninspired crap like the rest of Illumination is. It just feels too long adding things that don't need to be added, and it really shows, suffering from a problem that I've shown, like how Disney has made their own modern villains more sympathetic than needs to be, which this film does to a much worse degree because it is fucking Illumination. I don't even know why you would think Benadryl Blumberbus would be the perfect for this role, because it is weird the way he tries to perform the voice of the Grinch, but that probably has to do with the fact of the way they went about designing the character for this bland, generic kids movie. I mean, it's so bad that they thought it was better to focus on sequels to the original stories after, because they probably realized they cannot make any Dr. Seuss stories at all. And after that, and after the sequels we mentioned, brings us back to the Super Mario Bros. Movie, because this is a movie I've expressed that at its core is perfectly simple, and that wasn't a bad thing. I enjoyed it for what it was, considering that Nintendo was involved with it, producing alongside Illumination, out of respect for what they know and in Mario, which I love. Although Nintendo themselves are an evil corporation that's even worse than Disney, that still at the very least set out to make something better to adapt their video games than what we've seen in the past, with Miyamoto actually producing this one as well. But that doesn't mean it's a good story by any means, far from it, where it once again shows Illumination's ability and hand as a kid's movie factory with nothing else to show for it. But the reason I enjoyed this one particularly is because I like Mario and played the game since I was a child and enjoyed the references and respect it has for that in that way. So in those cases, those are reasons that actually connected me with this movie, but beyond that, completely agree with the critic ratings that it really has no story to offer or no real development of its characters, which of course upset many people online because they want to justify this fan fest as an actual great film, which it is actually not. Because at its core, it is an Illumination one that offers nothing grand for a story, bringing up the problem people have with its criticisms, where people were just looking for something to justify their own opinions, which added nothing else because you don't bother to look or understand of what people didn't like about the film. You just hate negative criticism because you loved Mario and you love the respect it had for its references, but beyond that, you're actually ignoring the concerns of Illumination as a studio to create actual story. Another problem to pile on to why I hate Illumination is because they continue to get away with producing mediocre movies that some people will defend because it had something they like and pays respect to it at the very least with what is involved, except for the 80 songs they introduced in Mario, which that was an absolutely terrible choice for this entire world, where somehow Illumination just wants to continue to be hip with the kids crowd and funny, which it actually doesn't work in my opinion. It's stupid to include stuff like the Beastie Boys in a Mario movie. And because it's Mario, of course, this was going to be another great hit for Illumination's hands, with $1.3 billion becoming the third highest grossing animated film of all time, where it's not two, because no matter how many times Disney likes to try to say, or anyone else who stupidly thinks so, The Lion King 2019 is an animated movie and nothing will change that. But looking deep at their other films that made $1 billion fosters this notion that this style should be continued, which worries a lot about its own future. I mean, they have original films coming out later this year like Migration, but then you have the rumors about Nintendo wanting to adapt more films with Universal and Illumination with the likes of Zelda. Now at this point, these rumors actually have been shut down by Chris Meledandri, the CEO and founder of Illumination, but it still doesn't deny that Nintendo is looking for Illumination to adapt their stories, which Chris is actually a part of Nintendo's board of directors at this point, meaning they have a direct relationship movie-wise with this studio, which still looks bad if they they actually wanted to adapt Zelda in that situation, because looking at a property like Zelda and a studio like Illumination, that will not end well with the type of very story that Zelda presents, because like what Mario has proved recently, they are just virtually incapable of doing so like they've done in the past, and should leave it to a studio like DreamWorks instead. I mean, that's not to say that they can't if Nintendo is actually still part of producing the film and can provide something similar to what the games have done, like the respect that Mario has shown, but I just know that they can't, knowing that even through the Mario film they'd still continue the similar style they have been doing since Despicable Me with their outsourced animation. At their very best, Illumination is mediocre, and at their very worst, they are the most disrespectful corporatized cash grabs imaginable, and nothing else beyond that. And the future still holds more sequels to their top franchises of Despicable Me, Sing, and Pets, and only a few new ones in between depending on what Nintendo wants to do for their stories, where nothing new will be gained for any of that genre. All in all, Illumination is the studio that sells you product rather than real movies. The one and done trope where once those kids grow up, they will have nothing to look back upon in each of their movies. Nothing except visual eye candy and mediocre jokes not intent upon improving, because they don't really need to do that with how successful these films are upon release due to the broad appeals of families watch and go for the theaters for. And once again, like I stated in the case of Mario, everything about Illumination is perfectly simple. Not too much and not too little, but just enough to sell you minions for eternity, and that is truly pathetic. Not improving because Universal doesn't need them to with the other studios it has acquired, and that's not to say you can't enjoy them. If you do enjoy them, I respect that and that's your opinion, but for me and many others, it's just that Illumination does not attempt to do anything spectacular with any of their stories. In short, it's all simply stupid, and I'm all done, so goodbye.